What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to face a host who seems determined to provoke and humiliate him on live television? In just 34 seconds, a single inflammatory comment would expose the true character of a talk show host, leading to one of the most shocking walkouts in television history. Samuel L. Jackson had appeared on countless talk shows throughout his legendary career. From promoting blockbuster films to discussing his craft, he was known as a consummate professional who could handle any interview with grace and intelligence. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold on Greg Gutfeld's late-night show. The studio lights were bright that evening as Jackson settled into the guest chair, expecting the usual banter about his latest project. Gutfeld, known for his provocative style, seemed friendly enough during the commercial break, making small talk about the weather and thanking Jackson for coming on the show. "We're back with the one and only Samuel L. Jackson," Gutfeld announced to the camera as they returned from break. "Sam, thanks for being here tonight." "My pleasure, Greg. Always good to be here," Jackson replied with his characteristic smooth delivery. The first few minutes proceeded normally. They discussed Jackson's upcoming film, his thoughts on the current state of Hollywood, and even shared a few laughs about his famous on-screen intensity. Jackson seemed relaxed, leaning back in his chair and genuinely enjoying the conversation. But then something shifted in Gutfeld's demeanor, perhaps emboldened by Jackson's easygoing nature, or maybe seeking to create a viral moment. The host's questions began to take on a different tone. "You know, Sam, you've played a lot of tough guys over the years," Gutfeld said, his voice carrying a slight edge. "But in real life, you're pretty different from those characters, aren't you?" Jackson raised an eyebrow slightly. "Well, sure, I'm an actor. Most of us don't go around doing the things our characters do." Right, Gutfeld nodded, but there was something calculating in his expression. "It's just interesting how Hollywood creates these larger-than-life personas. Sometimes I wonder if audiences forget that underneath all that swagger, you're really just—" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Just what?" Jackson asked, his voice still calm but with a hint of warning. "Well, you know what I mean," Gutfeld continued, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. "The whole tough guy thing, it's all an act, right? In reality, you're probably more like the rest of us. Regular guy, suburban life, probably watches cooking shows and worries about his cholesterol." The audience laughed nervously, unsure whether this was playful ribbing or something more pointed. Jackson maintained his composure, but those familiar with his work could see the subtle change in his posture. "I think you might be surprised by how much of myself I put into those roles," Jackson replied carefully. Gutfeld leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "Come on, though. You have to admit there's something almost comical about this idea that movie stars are these untouchable figures. Like, you're sitting here in your nice suit, being all polite and media-trained, and we're supposed to believe you're some kind of badass?" The studio fell quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something had shifted. Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think anyone's asking you to believe anything," Jackson said, his voice dropping slightly. "I'm here to talk about my work." But Gutfeld wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by Jackson's discomfort. "I'm just saying there's this whole mythology around certain actors, you know? Like they're somehow different from regular people, more dangerous, more intense. But at the end of the day, you guys are entertainers. You memorize lines and hit your marks. It's not exactly Navy SEAL training." The comparison was clearly meant to diminish Jackson's screen presence, to reduce decades of carefully crafted performances to mere pretense. Jackson sat forward slightly, his hands clasped. "You seem to have some very specific thoughts about what I do for a living," he said quietly. "I'm just being honest," Gutfeld replied with a shrug that seemed designed to appear casual but came across as dismissive. "I think sometimes the entertainment industry takes itself a little too seriously, like when actors start thinking they're actually the characters they play. And you think that's what I'm doing? I'm not saying you specifically, but—" Gutfeld paused, as if considering his words. But it was clear he was building to something. "Look, you've built a career on playing intimidating characters. The angry guy, the tough guy, the guy who doesn't take any nonsense. But we're all adults here. We know it's just movies." Jackson nodded slowly, processing not just the words, but the intent behind them. "You're right. We are all adults here." "Exactly," Gutfeld said, seeming to think he had made his point successfully. "So we can have an honest conversation about the difference between Hollywood fantasy and reality." "We absolutely can," Jackson agreed. "So let me be honest with you." There was something in his tone that made Gutfeld pause, perhaps finally realizing that he might have pushed too far. but it was too late to change course now. I've been doing this for over 30 years, Jackson continued, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. I've worked with some of the most talented people in the industry, told stories that matter to millions of people, and yes, I've played characters who don't back down from bullies. The word bullies hung in the air like a challenge. And you know what I've learned in all that time? Jackson continued. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who talk about being tough. They're the ones who don't need to. Gutfeld's smile faltered for just a moment before he tried to regain control of the situation. Hey, I'm not trying to be a bully here, Sam. I'm just having a conversation. Are you? Jackson asked, his voice carrying the same quiet intensity that had made him famous. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you invited me on your show just to try and make me look small. The audience was completely silent now. Even the studio crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep filming or cut to commercial. Gutfeld shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. Look, I think you're being a little sensitive here, Gutfeld said, attempting to sound reasonable but coming across as condescending. This is late-night television. We joke around. We have fun. That's what people expect. Fun? Jackson repeated, tilting his head slightly. You think diminishing someone's life work is fun? I'm not diminishing anything. I'm just pointing out that there's a difference between movies and real life. I mean, come on, you have to see the irony here. You're getting upset about me questioning your tough guy image, which kind of proves my point. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Jackson stared at Gutfeld for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. You know what's ironic? Jackson finally said. You sit behind this desk every night, making jokes about other people, thinking that gives you some kind of power. But the moment someone pushes back, even a little bit, you start talking about how they're being too sensitive. Gutfeld's face was starting to redden, but he pressed on. I'm not the one getting worked up here. No, you're not worked up, Jackson agreed. You're something worse. You're comfortable. Comfortable sitting in your little bubble, taking shots at people who actually put themselves out there, actually create something. Tell me, Greg, what's the hardest thing you've ever done in your career? Write a mean tweet? The insult landed like a physical blow. Gutfeld's professional demeanor cracked completely. Excuse me? I've been in this business for 20 years. I built a successful show. I have millions of viewers. I don't need career advice from someone who plays make-believe for a living. And there it was. The mask was finally off. Jackson nodded slowly, as if Gutfeld had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. Make-believe. That's what you think this is, isn't it? Gutfeld shot back, his voice rising. You dress up in costumes, you say words other people wrote for you, and somehow that makes you an expert on everything? At least I deal with real issues, real problems. I don't hide behind fictional characters. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Jackson sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, just looking at his host with an expression that was somehow both calm and terrifying. You want to talk about real issues? Jackson said softly. Let's talk about respect. Let's talk about treating people with basic human dignity. Let's talk about not inviting someone onto your show just so you can tear them down to make yourself feel bigger. Nobody's tearing anybody down, Gutfeld protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. Really? Then what would you call the last 10 minutes? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you brought me here to humiliate me. Maybe you thought it would be easy. Maybe you thought I'd just sit here and take it because that's what guests are supposed to do. Jackson leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Gutfeld's face. But here's the thing you clearly don't understand. Those characters I play, the ones you think are so fake, they're not separate from who I am. They're parts of me. The part that doesn't tolerate disrespect, the part that stands up to people who think they can push others around just because they have a platform. Gutfeld was visibly sweating now, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he'd made a mistake. Instead, he doubled down. Look, if you can't handle a little criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. This is how these shows work. We ask tough questions. We challenge people. That's what good journalism is about. Jackson actually smiled at that, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Journalism? Is that what you call this? Because I thought journalism was about seeking truth, not creating conflict for entertainment. I thought it was about informing people, not making yourself the star of your own show by attacking your guests. I'm not attacking anyone, Gutfeld insisted, but even he seemed to realize how hollow that sounded. No? Then what do you call questioning my professionalism, my intelligence, my entire career? What do you call suggesting that everything I've worked for is just pretend? Because where I come from, we have a word for people who do that. The threat wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in the studio could feel the temperature dropping. Gutfeld made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Okay, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Talk about something else. But Jackson was already shaking his head. No, Greg, we're not starting over. Because this isn't about getting off on the wrong foot. This is about who you really are when you think the cameras are rolling and nobody can touch you. He stood up from his chair, moving with the same controlled power that had made him a star. You want to know the difference between me and my characters? My characters would have walked out 5 minutes ago. I stayed because I thought maybe, just maybe, you were better than this. I thought maybe there was a real conversation to be had here. Jackson began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. But you're not interested in conversation. You're interested in being right, even when you're wrong. You're interested in being the big man, even when it means making yourself small. And most of all, you're interested in hiding behind your desk and your audience and your producers, thinking that makes you untouchable. Gutfeld watched in growing panic as Jackson methodically removed his microphone pack, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. His show was falling apart in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Sam, wait," Gutfeld said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "We don't have to end it like this. Look, maybe I came on a little strong, but that's just my style. People expect that from me." Jackson paused in his movements, looking up at his host with something that might have been pity. "Your style?" he repeated quietly. "You know what's sad about that, Greg? You actually think being cruel is a style. You think disrespecting people is entertainment, but there's nothing stylish about what you just did. There's nothing entertaining about trying to humiliate someone who came here in good faith." The studio audience sat in stunned silence, some of them looking embarrassed to be witnessing this meltdown. A few were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly recording what they knew would become a viral moment. Gutfeld glanced nervously at the cameras, then back at Jackson. "Come on, don't be so dramatic. Sit back down. We'll talk about your movie. Everything will be fine." "Dramatic?" Jackson's voice carried that dangerous quiet that anyone who'd seen his films would recognize. "You spend 10 minutes trying to tear down everything I've worked for, and when I respond with dignity, you call me dramatic?" "I wasn't trying to tear down anything," Gutfeld protested weakly. "Then what were you trying to do?" Jackson asked, placing his microphone on the coffee table between them. "Enlighten me. What was the point of all that?" Gutfeld opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. "That's what I thought," Jackson said. "You don't even know why you did it. You just saw an opportunity to take shots at someone, and you took it, because that's what you do. That's who you are." The host made one more desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "Look, you're overreacting here. This is television. Things get heated sometime. That doesn't mean we can't be professional about it." Jackson stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Professional? You want to talk to me about being professional? I've been doing interviews for 3 decades, Greg. I've sat across from journalists, comedians, talk show hosts, and yes, even people who didn't like me or my work. And you know what they all had in common? They treated me like a human being." He gestured around the studio, taking in the cameras, the lights, the frozen crew members. "You brought me into your house, Greg. You invited me to be your guest. And then you spent the entire time trying to make me feel small, trying to convince your audience that I'm somehow less than what I appear to be. Do you understand how twisted that is?" Gutfeld's face was now completely red, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this." "No," Jackson agreed. "You don't. But your audience does. Your crew does. And they're all watching you right now, seeing exactly who you really are when someone doesn't just roll over and take your abuse." The actor moved toward the edge of the stage, but then stopped and turned back one final time. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Greg? You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's lived an interesting life, someone who might have had something valuable to share with your viewers. Instead, you chose to turn it into some kind of power game that you were never going to win." "I wasn't trying to win anything," Gutfeld said, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. "Weren't you? Because it sure looked like you were trying to prove something. Maybe to your audience, maybe to yourself. But the only thing you proved tonight is that having a television show doesn't make you important. It just gives you a platform to show everyone who you really are." Jackson took a step toward the desk, and Gutfeld actually recoiled slightly. "And who you really are, Greg, is someone who thinks other people's success somehow diminishes your own. Someone who thinks the only way to build himself up is to tear others down. Someone who confuses being mean with being clever." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the production crew seemed afraid to move, as if any sound might shatter the tension that had built up over the course of the interview. "I've met a lot of people in this business," Jackson continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Good people, bad people, talented people, people who are just lucky. But the ones who last, the ones who build something real, they understand something you clearly don't." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Respect isn't something you take from people. It's something you earn, and you can't earn it by trying to steal it from someone else." Gutfeld made one final, pathetic attempt to regain control. "You know what? Fine. Leave. See if I care. We'll get someone else who actually wants to be here." Jackson smiled at that. A genuine smile this time. There it is. The real you. Not the television host, not the professional interviewer, just a small man having a tantrum because someone stood up to him. He headed toward the exit, but called back over his shoulder. "Good luck finding guests who want to be here after tonight, Greg, because word travels fast in this town, and people remember how they're treated." As Jackson disappeared into the wings, the studio remained frozen in shock. Gutfeld sat alone at his desk, staring at the empty guest chair, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in.